Hello, hope you hear me. I'll take the silence as a yes. Just order the papers. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. When big hedge funds like BlackRock can basically own and monopolize how much we pay for housing, what are the conditions that we actually rent houses, I do believe this is an incredibly unfair setup, which makes that all renters pay more, means that housing is less affordable, and it basically means that all of us have to pocket out more for housing, leaving us with less money for other more important stuff. What is actually the setup that I basically want to start the debate with? I think there are only two things in model which we kind of need to be clear on, right? I think first of all, this policy basically means that only private citizens will basically be able to hold housing and to basically kind of own it. I think that probably how much housing per person can you basically own is something which is not that important. I think most often people have up to 4 to maybe 5 apartments, but I don't think it generally goes more than that. Secondly, I do believe that it will compensate fairly all of the companies which at the moment basically own these apartments. I do believe that after that, governments will just sell it out to private citizens. I don't think this will be that big of a hassle. With all this being said, why do we need this debate at the moment, right? I'm going to start with kind of impacting and pointing out what is the issue at the status quo, right? The issue at the status quo is that a bunch of very, very rich hedge funds perceive housing to be the safest investment, right? Specifically since the inflation is rising, we have war in Ukraine, right? Very often investors seek housing as the most safest thing, right? What this actually leads to is them buying a bunch of apartments from private citizens at the moment, right? Not building new existing ones, but basically just buying houses which already exist in the status quo, right? Basically meaning that overall, we have less houses that other private citizens can buy, and it means that in certain areas, these private companies have complete monopolies on renting out apartments, right? Why do companies, to some extent, don't build housing, but just buy the existing one? Because I do believe this will be the majority of attacks from, these companies have an incentive to basically build new housing, right? 3 reasons why, in majority of cases, they just buy the existing one, right? First of all, this is instant profit, right? If I buy a house which is already built or an apartment which is already built and I can just rent it out, I get profit immediately compared to me investing in construction, which very often takes a couple of years. And this is often something which is a huge risk for hedge funds, right? Because I'm not sure whether in 4 to 5 years, the housing market will still be very favorable. Second of all, right, this is just cheaper, right? The biggest cost when you build actually an apartment is the land itself, right? This is the largest fixed cost that you have to pay for. That's why hedge funds will just decide to not buy the specific land and build on it. Right? They will just choose to buy apartments because this is something which is much cheaper. They don't have to pay for land on which the apartments have been built. Third of all, this is just less effort, right? Specifically, since a bunch of these companies are not inherently construction companies, right? Hassling with subcontractors and basically hassling with all the delays and all the budgetary constraints which very often come when you have to build a house, is something which is a huge hassle. I don't think they have an incentive to do it, right? And that's why I do believe it is far easier if you just buy the housing which already exists, right? So I do believe that at the end of this, the impact is we don't get any new housing, right? In majority of cases, these companies just buy existing houses, and I don't think can claim that as a benefit. With all this being said, what is the harm of this? First of all, you can actually monopolize the price and the conditions that you actually rent out apartments, right? Because notice that if a big company very often owns all the apartments in one building or all the apartments in a specific area, right? They can basically dictate what will the price be, what are going to be the conditions, whether your pets are going to be allowed there or not, right? And it's incredibly hard for you, for example, to go and seek other prices, specifically if, for example, you need to live in a specific area because your kids go there to school, because you're constrained by your job and all of these things, right? Very often there will be no competition. That's why you will basically be left with a higher price that you would not have to otherwise pay. What is the comparative, right? I lent from an individual, right? Why the individual is far more likely to give me a lower price? First of all, they don't have such a monopoly power on the of basically apartments, right? It's very often most people own 1 to 2 apartments, and they know if I don't offer you a good price, you will just leave and basically rent an apartment from someone else, right? And there's nothing that you can basically do to stop them. This is why very often private landlords do have an incentive to offer you a lower price. because they know they're actively in competition with other private landlords. Second of all, right, very often I have only one apartment which I'm renting, meaning I'm very dependent on me successfully renting out the apartment, right? That's why, for example, I'm more likely to be open for negotiations around price, around conditions, and all of these things, because I actually have a vested interest in having someone living in their apartment actually providing my food for next month, compared to a huge company, right? If you're gonna set their terms, they don't fucking care, right? They have a bunch of other apartments which they're successfully renting out, meaning even if they lose on one customer, and even if you don't like their terms and price, there's nothing that you can basically do about it, meaning they're less likely to negotiate with you, less likely to generally kind of compromise. What is the impact of this, right? First of all, I just pay more for housing. Notice how harmful this is, specifically in the moment when we have such high inflation, when a bunch of people have huge student loan debts, right? This basically means that at the end of the day, we have less money to invest in our homes, in us, in our kids, and all of these things. And this is very, very harmful. Second of all, this just pushes the price of housing, right? And makes it unaffordable for people, right? As I said at the beginning, because most of these companies will just buy existing apartments, right? The issue which is going to happen is twofold, right? First of all, they can just offer more money than a regular person, right, for a specific apartment, because really often they have huge margins of profit, meaning they can basically pay a bit more than an ordinary person would pay for buying that specific apartment. So there's a huge demand which these companies basically create when they decide that they actually want to expand in this business, right? That means that they are driving up the demand. That means they're also driving up the price very, very, very high. And third of all, very often construction companies, because they know that their homes will most likely be bought by these companies, have an incentive to make their production also be very expensive, because they know that these companies will be able to compensate for it. COPOI, please.
Just to be clear, what happens to the people that are already living in these houses when you ban these corporate residential landlords?
So to some extent, right, we would offer this on a free market. Whoever buys the apartment will be able to dictate how much renting and how much the price people will pay, right? So to some extent, as I said at the beginning, at the end, constructors actually now, when they know that their homes will most likely be bought by these companies, have also an incentive to drive up the price of construction of these companies. The impact of this is housing just becomes either very, very expensive or be just plainly unaffordable for a bunch of people. That does not happen when basically the only people that are buying apartments are private individuals who very often are constrained with how much mortgage they can actually have, with how much credit they have, right? That means to some extent that the demand is lower, but it also means that the purchasing power of people who are buying apartments is just inherently lower. I think you also will talk about why regulation is impossible, but I just want to give you the intuition pump, right? Even in states and even in cities where regulation is happening at the moment, like Berlin, right? These huge companies are very often skilled in basically going around them, right? In finding loopholes, right? In Berlin, if I just put a furniture in my apartment, I don't have to actually put the low price of renting that the state mandates of me to do, right? These companies are incredibly skilled in basically going through these loopholes. They make housing unaffordable for all of us, and all of us pay a higher rent. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much to Prime Minister. We are very happy to call leader of the opposition to open the case for the opposition bench.
Audible, right? Okay, starting in a second. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. I think everything in this debate is comparative. We're just going to basically try to flip everything and then present one point about why this allows companies to be more profitable, which is better for workers in general. And secondly, why companies have asymmetrical incentives not to be discriminatory towards certain racial groups in society. Before that, 5 reasons as to why companies are not fucking buying already existing homes. Why is that the case? The first thing I just want to generally point out is that in the vast majority of cases, you want better quality of materials and construction. You have more flexibility and a higher capacity to get active housing with better technology at the point at which you're actively buying new construction projects, which are more sustainable and more profitable over the long term, and you won't have more costs for maintenance. The second thing I just want to generally point out is that not many people are selling their homes. That is to say, everybody knows it's heavily profitable, so you don't want to pay selling. In the vast majority of cases, many people buy homes as a long-term investment, which means they're settling down in their homes. Thirdly, you wish to choose the location to maximize your profits over the long term to something that is very flexible towards you. Fourthly, you want to buy multiple homes at once, which is often enough not feasible with already existing infrastructures. You want to do it with a construction company, which is comparatively easier for you, and this is comparatively better for you to offset the costs and to better be able to administer the costs at the point in which you have multiple apartments in a one specific place. And fifthly, if you are buying a few properties from a construction company, comparatively, when you are the person that is allowing them to make this project to begin with, you are getting comparatively better conditions. Companies are profit maximizing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they want to maximize their profits over the short term. That is to say, they often have played the long game and wish to maximize their profits by diversifying their portfolio, ensuring sustainability and long-term profits, which actively means that they want to do this in terms of investing in new housing. The sixth thing that I just want to generally point out, and this is on to construct, they give incentives to construction companies to create new housing that otherwise wouldn't exist. Creating new housing for specifically residential use is something that companies are not doing often enough. Why? Firstly, it is comparatively easier for you to cater to rich middle-class people and rich people with singular houses that are comparatively easier and quicker to construct, which means companies specifically requiring apartments that are huge in size and allow for a quantity of residential use is something that asymmetrically changes on our side. Secondly, it is very risky because there is a lot of administration, a lot of waiting, and a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether or not you'll be able to get your money in, which actively means companies are able to fill in this gap. Why is that the case? They can fill in this gap because they create a massive amount of demand. That is to say, they're buying multiple properties at once, which is giving you a massive cash flow. But secondly, comparatively, they're able to give you to like pay much faster for this, considering they're comparatively richer than even in the best case on the other side, the average middle class person, which means many companies doing this actively means that we have asymmetrically more demand for more housing, which trickles down to people. Finally, it is not just a single company that is doing this. In the vast majority of cases, if we take the OG's analysis at their best, all companies know that it's very profitable, which means they're actively competing to do this. But secondly, even BlackRock doesn't have the capacity to buy every single property. This debate necessarily has to exist in an environment of competition. Now, onto incentives of companies and why they're comparatively better than the average, like privileged landlord. First, companies have good incentives because firstly, they're competing with one another. That is to say, they want to offer comparatively better conditions and comparatively better prices compared to other companies that are now labeling themselves as rating out agents. Secondly, it is not so crucial for them to hijack the price, considering they have other sources of revenue, other places that they're actively renting, or their company has other ways in which they're earning money, which means compared to a singular landlord, they don't have the incentive to hijack the prices as much as possible. More so, they want sustainable development and sustainable profits. Thirdly, they're accountable to outside sources. That is to say, in our modern age of ethical consumerism, in which companies actually care about their image, in which there are also internal mechanisms in the board of directors, in the co-workers are actively calling them out. If those companies are actively hijacking the prices, you can leave a horrible review at their site, which comparatively not only hurts the profits of the renting agency, but also it trickles down to other sectors of those specific companies. Why on the comparative, landlords are horrible? A few reasons. Firstly, most likely the comparative is privileged middle class or rich people that are actively buying out those properties. Firstly, those people are not accountable to anybody, and there is no stringent mechanism through which you can hold them accountable at the point in which they're offering horrible conditions. Secondly, often enough, there are massive cases in which those people are prejudiced against certain groups. That is to say, there are notorious cases in Hong Kong and in Singapore in which they're actively prejudiced against all nations from Asia, which actively undercuts the capacity of discriminated groups to get affordable housing. On the comparative, companies just want to maximize their profits. Thirdly, their financial situation is much more unstable. They're more likely to be short-termistically selfish and irrational. They're more likely comparatively to hijack the price. Why is this important? I think it's important because we have asymmetrically higher prices, asymmetrically worse conditions, and finally, we have irrational, prejudiced ways in which people are discriminated on the basis of their race and on the basis of their ethnicity, which means we are able to remove this, considering we have a culture in which companies wish to maximize the way in which people perceive them as legitimate, as progressive, which actively means that comparatively on our side, those companies are not acting in such vicious ways because they don't care about ethnicity or race. But simply, even if they do this, they have a massive amount of image to lose, which actually means they're going to get hurt. This is comparatively better. This is comparatively impactful because This actually means that more people that are actively discriminated upon can find secure renting places, which allows them the ability to function to begin with. But secondly, it's comparatively more affordable and actively saves them a lot of financial strain. Before I continue, I'll take a point from closing.
These organizations are less likely to be prejudiced against individuals, and these individuals, insofar as they're more likely to have human empathy and things like that when they have to interact with their renters on a daily basis.
No, this is not active. This is just not the case. They're more likely to be friendly, considering if people are actively paying, if they only care about profit. If they're interacting with them on a day-to-day basis and they're actively racist, this actively means they're likely to reinforce their own biases and prejudice and to get for the situation to get even worse. Finally, onto profitability of companies and why this is hugely important. I'm going to be really honest here. I think this is a massively profitable thing for companies, but I think it's a good thing. Why? Because compared to other sources of revenue, for example, projects that may fail, certain services and products that you are actively doing, but you may have supply side issues currently experiencing, or secondly, they may go out of fashion, or thirdly, somebody else is actively hurting you. This actively is a secure and consistent source of revenue that firstly, you can use at the point at which financial tools are not accessible because loans are not accessible for every single company. But secondly, this
Thank you very much to the leader of the opposition. I'm very happy to call DPN to continue the case for opening government.
on our side of the debate, which is presumably good. First, let's deal with refutation of opening opposition, because there's a lot here, right? Tell us, large corporations have a significant incentive to build sustainable housing because not because everybody will sell their house, so therefore, they will just build more. Note that large-scale investors actually do have an incentive to not build. Marta already gives you 5 mechanisms for why they don't. But even if they have some incentive to build, note that this incentive exists also for small-scale investors, because there are people who still want to buy houses on our side of the debate to invest. You get an apartment on a mortgage that then you pay off through the rent you collect. You only pay like 10-20% down payment, and so you still have people wanting to invest in the housing market. The comparative isn't you have large-scale investors or no investors. Here you have large-scale investors and small versus small-scale investors. That is something opening opposition does not actually explain to us. Then additionally, however, they tell us, but there's no large-scale incentive to create new housing. Let's say for argument's sake, you don't believe that small-scale investors have the same incentive to build. Construction firms have the incentive to build. Why? Because there are zoning regulations that mean that in certain areas, the only thing you can construct is housing. You can't just always construct everywhere housing and financial buildings, etc. Right? If that incentive exists, then there are always going to be construction firms who are going to want to build housing, because when they're not building, when they're not selling, when they're not producing, they can't pay their workers, they can't keep their lights, they can't pay their own rent, they can't. They're not making a profit. The people owning those corporations aren't making profit off of it, so they still have an incentive to build houses, even if there aren't large-scale private investors on our side of the house. So there's always going to be an incentive to construct new housing regardless. Notice then that when it's additionally, if the demand rises that low that it becomes a significant incentive to not build even for construction and for private investors, and no one else will build, then presumably housing construction will be so cheap because the demand is so low that governments who now have significantly easier time building social housing on our side of the house, because the upfront cost of construction is so low. If the demand is effectively zero for it, then social housing construction becomes significantly cheaper as well. At that point, if it becomes such a large-scale issue, then governments can have a significantly easier time affording construction of social housing. Note that note, however, that we then get this idea, it's not just one company doing this, it's many companies, and they exist in competition with each other. So, first of all, it is unclear why all of these are in the same area, right? Because if we look at Berlin, for example, it's basically just Vonovia that owns it. If we look at New York, it's basically just BlackRock. If we look at Los Angeles and San Francisco, it's basically just Zillow. The reason these corporations don't actually want to compete with each other is the exact same mechanism that Marta explains. They want effective monopolies on a local scale because that allows them to abuse the information asymmetry that exists between tenant and landlord, where they can set the price, control the demand, control the supply, and effectively ensure that they maximize the amount of rent they squeeze out of every single person, reducing the amount of effective ability of people to rent significantly on our side of the house and squeezing them for everything that is worth. It is unclear to me why these companies will go into heavy competition with each other on both sides of the debate equally. Note that means then at that point, both in terms of whether or not new housing is going to be created, opening opposition is just fundamentally incorrect, and whether or not there's significant competition, they're also incorrect. Notice, however, that we have on our side a significantly higher likelihood for the competition mechanism that opening opposition wants to arise to happen, because you have multiple people, lots of small-scale people owning second apartments that they may be inherited from their parents, their grandparents, etc. You have people who are buying on investment in order to rent out, etc. These people are all in competition with each other, and all these people are competing for the best tenants and the ones who are most likely to consistently pay them off. Notice that these tenants are, it's unlikely that they're going to want to discriminate against them racially, because opening opposition says, if you're super racist, then you'll just do it. A couple of things on this. First of all, I think under their own incentive analysis for why people want to maximize their profit, they're more likely to take someone who can actually pay the monthly rent, who's unlikely to destroy their apartment, etc. Secondly, notice that if they are discriminating, there are lots of laws that actually prevent you from discriminating on racial basis. Notice that, I know our opposition is going to say, but people just ignore this. Okay, but large corporations ignore all kinds of regulations as well. And when the comparative is, I can sue BlackRock or I can sue my one racist landlord, the upfront cost and the upfront possibility of me actually winning my lawsuit against them for the skirting regulation is significantly higher on the side that is actually going to, go against a major corporate investor that have all the law firms, all the lawyers, that have the largest, corporate backing and so much money for their legal department that basically going up against them is significantly harder. The burden of doing that is significantly lowered. Before I go further into how regulation is significantly more easily skirted on our side of the house as opposed to opposition bench, I will take a POI from closing.
I'm a bit unclear. Where do you get the money to compensate these corporate, residential landlords on your side?
Most governments have that money. Notice that it's just any government that really can't afford it can just will probably nationalize it if they're that poor. It is highly unlikely, however, that a government that is that poor wouldn't have the ability. Like the city-state of Berlin was able to nationalize thousands of apartments. It's even if there are a small number of places where this is impossible, fine. Then the motion just cannot work there. Okay, you've discovered one place where we can't implement it, but obviously anywhere we could implement it, we will. Finally, then let's go on to regulation, because I think opposition could come up here and say, if not opening, then closing, we can just regulate all the bad things. We can set specific prices. We can limit how much you can raise the rent every month and so on. We think this is actually particularly unlikely. One, because over time, regulations can be weakened significantly through lobbying efforts by large corporations. When you have a unified lobbying effort by large-scale investors, they have the financial capital in order to actually oil the wheels of capital, through the wheels of capitalism, line the pockets of politicians in order to get them to change the regulations in the first place. Two, even if you have the regulations, skirting them and discovering loopholes in them is significantly easier when you have a large legal department whose explicit job is to discover those loopholes, operate on them, and utilize them in order to skirt them. This is, for example, when in Berlin there is a rent increase limit. All you need to do is literally put in a table, a chair, a bed, and at that point you can raise the price, because it is a furnished apartment, as much as you want, skirting the regulations that Berlin has put in place. These types of loopholes exist in every type of regulation and are often built in intentionally in order to achieve these goals. Large corporations are much more easily willing and able to do this. Proud to stand in government side.
Thank you very much for that speech, and very happy to call Diallo to close the debate on the front half.
Hi, I presume you can hear me.
Yeah.
Cool. POIs in chat, I'll take one from closing, and I'll begin in just a sec. Yeah, okay. 3, 2, 1. By OG's analysis, the companies that actually buy the apartments are hedge funds, right? The only thing that they have failed to do, though, is to prove why on the alternative, if you cannot buy this, why would hedge funds even invest in this and just not go to other routes, such as like even cryptocurrency or other forms of investment that are gaining more popularity and that hedge funds would like to invest in? Yes, they say this is the most stable one, but there are many other investments that are stable. Just, for example, just putting it in their RI funds in like SPF 500 company stuff like this. I'm not sure why this is the best alternative for this. I know you said it wrong word. Now, a few things to note here. Firstly, on why specifically individuals are less accountable than companies. Secondly, what are the incentives for states to regulate this? And thirdly, why we have better things such as poor people having more access to this. Firstly, on regulation, why does the state have a lot of incentives to regulate this in a good way? Few reasons on this. One, note that there's a huge scares from repeating 2008, right? Marta says, oh, you create bubbles, you like create demand, and this is very bad. But this is exactly the reason why states and regional authorities want to regulate this, right? Because they're very scared that this would happen again, that they will get the distrust of the people, and generally that banks also are very scared for this because they're scared of losing so much profit. Generally, this would mean that they will regulate it because of the history that this has happened before, therefore they're more careful. Secondly, on monopolies, note that if the states don't regulate monopolies, this is very bad for them on a few reasons. One, note that their legitimacy is contingent on this. If people cannot afford housing, and if people necessarily cannot opting into like buying a normal house and not having to get into debt, they blame the government. Thus, the government does not get re-elected. Thus, they do not want to do this. Secondly, though, even if you believe that this might be symmetrical because the governments will just place like price controls and shit like this, you don't do this because specifically for companies, you want the incentives to not look lobbied and corrupted, right? Because if you do this and companies are the main one that rent it out, governments, people can connect that because it's so expensive, you're just lobbied and corrupted and therefore don't want to. You don't have this incentive on the other side of the house. It's just because random individuals owning random houses that do not have the same big impact that anybody universally can agree upon. I would say that you can regulate one big company owning a lot of apartments within one region comparatively more than to like 100 individuals who own random houses and discriminate against people. Now, what does that mean? If the state has quite a few more incentives to regulate companies as opposed to individuals, what is the comparative? The comparative is because you have individuals, here's a few reasons why you cannot regulate them. One, there's just too many of them. You cannot necessarily check and regulate this as you don't probably have the budget to see who owns this or like just to follow up on this. Secondly, it's just generally you are it's not as big of an impact, right? Because you cannot calculate if one individual likely would not own 10 apartments. They will own 4 of them, but they will inflate the prices and they will also discriminate against people. But you as a state have a hard time knowing this comparatively worse than, for example, 2 companies owning this in like a city and you can basically regulate them. Thirdly, it's not profitable for you to do this. They say you can sue an individual. Fuck this. No, likely it's not firstly that profitable for you to do this. So secondly, you don't look as good in terms of your image as a state, because if you take down one big company, this is a huge win for you. If you take one individual, you look like the bad guy who just took their money and basically don't win anything from this. So if on the comparative we prove that companies are more accountable, why is this is especially important? One, note that Bisa already explained why accountability is very important. If you discriminate against people who are trying to rent out in the apartment, this is extremely bad because they cannot afford this, right? They would either have to go to another city and have to pay a lot more to go to find a good job, or just generally they would be homeless because right now everything is expensive. Secondly, if you deprive companies of having this profit, note that companies are the ones that can sometimes do unprofitable things when they have a lot of revenue, right? Because you can expand to the moment at which you can have constant revenue by having rents, but also having this big revenue from buying those apartments in the long run, which means you're the only one who can do those projects. For example, build housing in not so profitable areas because you have the money to do so. Individuals don't have this. But thirdly, on the comparative, and this is a very important clash we have with OG, where do we have more housing? A few things on this. One, note that we believe we have it more on our side with reasons that they did not rebut, which is construction companies, even they have to be sure that their buildings would be bought out. Otherwise, they will not do them. They have other things they can do. Yossi says you can do it for like other projects. You have zoning laws, but those are very uncommon because they want governments want their companies to be profitable and just generally allow them to do that. But secondly, even if it's not, I believe it's not as good because you can just invest in buildings such as corporate buildings or like maybe other sorts of infrastructure. I'm not sure why you're necessarily forced to do this for housing. On the comparative though, if you're sure that there are companies that will likely invest in this, you as a construction company are more sure ensuring building big housing projects and even making them more accessible, because you know you have a return on your investment, which is the most important thing that those construction companies care about. CG, do you have anything?
Even in your best case where the government, even if you prove that governments are scared, you don't have proof governments have the capacity to regulate this well, insofar as a revolving door of lobbyists exists and they experience constant pressure from lobbyists that affects their short-term campaign donations.
Here's the way. Even if you are lobbied a lot, you lose potential a lot more if you're not reelected. Why? Because lobbyists either help you just have a better campaign to be reelected. But if you're sure that you will not be reelected because people are unhappy, this is a higher incentive for you to do this. So people over companies. But secondly, even if this is the case, this is not, this is quite a marginal thing, right? Because most states are likely thinking about where they get reelected or who, or if the people are better. This is very important. I don't think it happens that often. Now, on the way of what is most important to see in this debate? A few things. Comparing individuals to companies. Who are individuals to worse in owning this stuff? One, note that they're extremely unregulated, aka they do this alone, so they're likely to get into their own biases and just fulfill them without anybody calling them out. On the comparative, companies are applied by many different people with many diverse views who can actively push for you to not be so scandalous. Secondly, you don't necessarily, you may compete with individuals, but not to the same scale, right? Because companies can be called out by medias, and medias love doing this. They love scandals, calling out and exposing companies for their bad practices, whereas medias, either one, have a very bad, they don't have access to the information to call out certain individuals, or two, will just not get the scandalous effect of the media attention that you call out a random individual that no one knows. Therefore, there's a lesser incentive for you to investigate this and actively regulate it. But lastly, this is in terms of practices, right? If you as an individual are have more old-fashioned views, and we already proved why this is likely to be the case, because old white men are the ones that are likely to have the inheritance and the money to be able to buy multiple apartments, which means that they are likely going to inflict their bad views on this. Comparatively, companies as I explained are acquired by different people who can call them out, who can put the diverse views and clash them out. What is left on the bottom lines? Even if we presume that the best case of prop is, less housing is built, either one, they do not prove the alternative why they have it better on their side of the house. We prove that if you have companies that are willing to pay, construction companies are willing to build. Secondly, we prove that companies have the profit to do so. And lastly, discrimination, but yes, vote us.
Thank you very much to Diola, and very happy to call member of the government to open the bottom half of this debate.
Great. Can you see and hear me like this?
Yes, all good.
Okay, wonderful. Almost all the incentives OO gives to you as to why companies will want to play fair relies on them having a long-run stake in the area. They have not proven this. They assume because they're landlords, they will always try to make money as landlords when they can quickly extrapolate wealth from the renters and then sell this land to the developers they know, because Blackstone's very powerful and they know a bunch of people who are willing to buy. This is the opening deadlock. It comes down to demonizing the incentives of companies, or praising the incentives of companies and saying why they have resources and things to do good. We're going to give you things that outframe both of these things. We're going to not rely on any specific problems with corporations, but tell you why the housing market is better on our side of house. Two things then that we add. One, why there's impossibility of accountability through the nuance of how these companies works. And second of all, a whole new argument on gentrification, which takes O at their best. Firstly then, on the impossibility of accountability, what you get from OG is the generic analysis that big companies have lobbying power and have a legal engine. But that misses the nuance of the specific housing market, which is the fact that they build financial webs. What does this look like? It looks like BlackRock doesn't own all of their companies just under the main subsidiary. Rather, they build liability subsidiaries to spread out these apartments to ensure they don't go down together, to ensure there's no clear PR connection between the few, and to assign this liability to different areas so that they're not economically fully dependent on each other and viewed as a monopoly, which means they might be subject to antitrust laws. What this means is a few-fold. One, we actually engage the accountability mechanisms of OO instead of just talking about lobbying or legal battles. Because if they rely on media backlash to make politicians care, this doesn't work for two reasons. One, media backlash does not work when there's no clear figurehead owning these companies. Even the main company is not the one that's legally associated with the apartment, but smaller names that are the subsidiaries. So for example, Hengda is super popular in China. They own the property that I live in, but they're framing as Jingqiu Yiying, which is a different name. And so we do not actually know until you do deep research that they're actually connected. So there is no media backlash against the main company versus local residents. The mom and pop renter. Like you live in the area, you know the people, you walk through the streets, they know you own this house, and they like can exert that pressure on you when you're abusive because these are your neighbors and people who you know and have social relationships with. 2, there's no political momentum because they said that you can just pressure politicians unless they call out these corporations, but you don't show why people are likely to make that connection to like pressure the right individuals, especially when like people being outraged about BlackRock relies on you explaining the complex financial web and making people understand what it means, and then they will opt into this political mission. They don't show why this accountability mechanism works. What this means is that we're the first team to engage on their accountability mechanisms, not just legal tussles, but politicians' incentives and media disputes. But secondly, we break the deadlock because this is not reliant on whether or not corporate landlords have perverse incentives or they're very abusive. Rather, we tell you the housing market naturally will have a lot of issues. Like for example, bubbles will form, rent control is needed, no matter like who's renting out, because sometimes the market just overheats and needs regulation. When we show you that accountability is very unlikely given the technicality of the nuance, this means politicians won't put it as their priority to like actually address these issues that naturally arise in the housing market, which means our material comes prior to everything else because of the necessity to regulate, the necessity of accountability. When we address this, we actually win off in terms of the safety mechanism of ensuring the market works. But second of all, onto our brand new argument about gentrification. How do these corporate landlords think about making money, and how do we go about it, and how does it lead to gentrification? They want to buy very cheap housing resources in currently like not the middle upper class neighborhoods because they can buy in with the cheapest price to extrapolate the most amount of profit because they can just like go off and rent in a market that needs houses, but they can buy it off from these people like who have less negotiating power, who are more desperate to sell, etc. Their incentive later on is to increase rent, right? This takes O at their best. These companies have long run stake. They want to continuously rent down the line. Then they at least want increased rent or increased demand within their own neighborhood in which their property is concentrated. What does this actualize in terms of their ability to cause gentrification? And why is gentrification good? 1, they might do targeted evictions of poor individuals or minorities because they have the legal team to back this up to ensure there's like no legal tussle. They can like scare them with a lot of lawsuits and things like that and go through with it. But this helps them make a lot of profit because when they clear off that group of people, the demographic of poor and minority individuals, you can sell to the mainstream people with certain racial biases and say, this is a safer neighborhood. This is a like cleaner neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that is more reliable, and play into that racist tendency to make more money given people's like association of criminalization with poor and minority individuals. So this changes, and this only works because you're a company, because you own a large enough amount of property that when you evict, you change the demographics of the area to actually gentrify the area and bring in like middle-class individuals. But 2, they have a large block like this. Like these companies are very powerful PE firms. They can sign deals and negotiate on behalf of like this entire property area and say, we want you to build a mall here and gentrify the area, versus individual residents don't have that kind of connection nor that kind of ability to promise that, you know, this is going to be a really rich neighborhood. Let's cooperate. So this is the ability and incentive for these corporate landlords to increase gentrification on their side. Let's look at the comparative. But before that, a point from CO. CO then.
Your analysis is dependent on them being able to monopolize. Companies that have an active incentive to compete, considering they don't want to concede the region because eventually the company will expand to another region, which would undercut their profits. But secondly, to begin with, they don't want to like give up a whole region.
I'll respond to the first one. So corporations, first of all, the info site says they're going to have like a massive amount. They're going to have like accumulation of amounts of like apartments. But 2, even if they just have a few, like multiple, they still have the incentive to sign deals like malls and stuff to be built to increase the demand and gentrification in the area, but also first mover advantage. Like they would just want to get the cheapest housing source, and it's better when they buy in bulk and they buy in the same neighborhood so that all their investments are like more worth it. So all these are reasons why they will have enough houses to achieve this effect. Why are individual landlords unable to do this? 1, they don't want gentrification because they might move back. This is still their house. They might come back with their kids and live here at some point because it's our property and a safety net. I don't want living costs like skyrocket because my kids might be living in my apartment and I do not want that. Second of all, they don't have the ability. They don't have the ability to sign deals with these like malls. They don't have the ability to change the demographics single-handedly with the very few houses they own. They have to at least agree that corporations are going to own more houses. What is the impact of this? 1, our impact is not constrained by case-by-case basis, like the specific apartments owned by corporate landlords. Rather, the entire neighborhood's living cost is going to go up. It is harder to pay rent even if your rent doesn't change because of gentrification and living costs going up. But 2, minorities and low-income individuals are definitely targeted. It just makes your building even more compelling to people with racialized tendencies to say we have evict these people more targetedly, and they lose that ability to live there. Thirdly, these low-income renters are largely migrant workers, so this impact is even larger than you think, because without a very low place to have rent, they lose the ability to have social mobility, to pay a low price and stay in the city and work, and they might be forced out of these urban places. So this means even if OO gets their best case, these companies have sustainable interests and they will build houses. Gentrification still means they bring the most vulnerable down. For all these reasons, we're so proud to propose.
Thank you very much to member of the government, and very happy to call member of the opposition to open the case for closing opposition.
Hi, can I confirm that I'm audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, also, I consent to streaming. Just give me 20 seconds. I'm setting up my timer. Cool. Assuming I'm still audible, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. WSCC coaches are going to be very angry with opening government's case because this was a policy motion that required them to have a proper model. And I'm just going to show you as to why their model is really, really bad in the motion, which is why I think they don't get any benefits that they want in this debate. The path to victory for closing opposition in this debate is going to be as follows. First, I'm going to prove to you as to why this policy specifically reduces the financial capacity of governments to create more equitable housing. And secondly, I'm going to prove to you as to why corporate residential landlords are in a unique position to expand out of cities to create more equitable housing for the most vulnerable. And that's what you lose out the point at which you ban this policy. Finally, if I have time, I will respond to closing government, right? Firstly, on the first extension of why this reduces the financial capacity of governments to create equitable housing, I just want to make an observation on what opening government has as their model. We first ask them, where do you get the money? They say, oh, governments have the money, right? Obviously, but this is a policy motion, which means you need to prove how they get the money, why the money is sufficient, how is the way in which you will decide compensation, and all of those sorts of things, right? There are 5 structural reasons as to why governments will have to instantaneously pay a huge sum of money and will have to incur huge amounts of losses as a result of this policy. Number 1, the policy currently is in contravention of legal arrangements that you already have, which means that you've already signed legal arrangements previously with a lot of these corporate real estate developers that they can develop houses there, they can exist here. The point at which you suddenly change this policy, they're going to have huge lawsuits upon you, which you need to deal with, right? But secondly, if these houses are fully furnished, they're already bought off as opening government characterizes, and they're literally in a big city, like all big cities in the country, that means that the cost of housing is going to be incredibly huge because these are in the middle of the city center, housing prices are high. But 3, if opening government is correct, landlords set the terms of pricing. These corporate real estate developers are the ones who are going to probably dictate the price at which the government has to compensate them, which means they're going to ask for a very, very high price, right? But number 4, oftentimes these corporate residentials often have bank loans which they need to pay off, right? Which means they've often paid partly paid the cost to the bank, but they probably have bank loans which they already have, which means you not just need to pay the corporate residentials, you also need to pay the bank loans, which means there's a huge compounding effect because you need to pay interest rate, because you need to pay huge some of financial institutions, right? But finally, look at what happens when no one buys these houses. If very few people buy these houses, this is a sunk cost for the government, which means the government literally loses money. Opening government gives you no reason as to why people are going to buy these houses, right? What does this prove to you, right? This proves to you that 3 scenarios, right? Number 1, in the event in which some people end up buying these houses, I would posit this is going to be private landlords, because opening government is literally putting these houses on the quote-unquote free market. Guess who's going to buy these properties in the free market? It's probably private landlords, which means we multiply opening opposition's impacts on scale by 100-fold, because we show you so many more private landlords increase as a result of this, right? But the second case I would like to consider is where probably governments nationalize this sort of housing, right? At that point in time, governments are bleeding money because they're not making any money with empty houses, which means they're eager to get these houses off their balance sheet. The point at which they do that, you probably have subprime lenders a lot more. You probably give off money to whoever wants to buy these houses, which means you create a housing crisis in the entire city because a lot of subprime lenders with questionable credit histories end up buying these houses, right? But thirdly, I would posit governments don't make this money back because there's a lot of policy uncertainty. A lot of people don't want to buy these houses because they're like, okay, today you ban corporate residential, whatever. What if you ban my housing tomorrow? What if you bring in more policy uncertainty tomorrow? Which is why governments are unlikely to be able to make this money. Why is this argument so important, right? What can governments do with this money otherwise? They can do four crucial things exclusively in opposition. One, you can build things like social housing a lot more, right? You can build housing, especially for the poor in these city centers where poor often don't have access to these housing. But number two, you can subsidize existing houses. You can probably give out more loans to the vulnerable so that they can afford these houses better. But number three, you're able to go up against lobbies a lot more on our side because you as a government are not desperate for money. You don't need money from corporations because your financial statements are not already so bad, which means your ability to counter corporations and lobbying intrinsically is higher on our side. But fourthly, you have the ability to build environmentally friendly cities only on our side, right? A lot of cities have a problem where there's so much pollution, there is very little greenery, right? Because a lot of like people have built in houses, there's no greenery, like there's no environmental standards. Your ability to build more parks, like more things that make the quality of life better of people is exclusively higher on our side because you have the money to do all of these sorts of things. What is the weighing for this argument? Why does this weigh over opening opposition? Four reasons for weighing, right? Number one, our argument is independent of the top half clash of whether companies are going to buy existing houses or are they going to build new houses. Because regardless of what they do, to the extent to which the government is buying these houses of corporations, the government needs to pay them, which means all our harms accrue independent of the top half clash. But secondly, in terms of uniqueness to the motion, all of opening opposition's arguments about private landlords being bad probably happens on both sides because private landlords exist on both sides. Our harm happens exclusively as a result of the motion because we tell you governments only have to buy this housing only on our side. But three, we also weigh out opening opposition on scale because it is unsure how many like private landlords are there in opening opposition. Maybe there are a few of them, maybe there are a lot of them. But we tell you this policy systematically disenfranchises everything that the government could do because the government could have built subsidized housing, government could have done so many other things. It destroys the functionality of government on scale. But four, we also weigh on long term, right? Because maybe after a point, private landlords become better. Maybe after a point, corporations become better. We don't care. We show you to the extent to which governments have a welfare mandate, they can't make profit, which means they can't make this money back, which means in 10 years, the government still don't have the money. This is the most long-term impact in the round, which is why the first extension automatically, independently wins us the round. Before I move on to my second extension, opening government.
So governments have a unique ability to actually finance this through debt, through budgets, and governments around the world do it very often. They privatize housing, national housing without any bashing. And I don't think like a World Schools coach would actually love a case fully based on model bashing.
No, it's not fully based on the model bashing. Also, like you had to structurally prove why governments can take on debt, not ask that in a POI. So I don't think that matters, right? But second extension on why corporate residentials have the unique ability to expand out of cities and create more equitable housing, right? Four structural reasons for this. Number one, like areas in the outskirts of cities, and area in tier 2 cities, tier 3 cities are often places where land is cheaper, labor is cheaper. So you as a corporation need to pay far lesser to construct these sorts of houses, which is why an incentive to go out of cities. But number two, you can often categorize these investments in tier 2 and tier 3 cities as ESG investment because technically you're giving back to the community, you're building affordable housing to them. You can probably subsidize some of the houses in these areas, which classify as ESG investment. And most companies want ESG investments because a lot of investors care about environmentally sensitive like things, right? Which is why this is true. But thirdly, they have sophisticated data and analytics teams which tell them exactly how to minimize costs. That's why they're able to figure out how to best build houses where there are no houses right now, right? But fourthly, they can incentivize other large companies like malls, grocery shops, other people to come and set up shop in these areas because they are so big. They're probably as big as BlackRock, which means they have the only ability to build housing outside of cities. Why is this important, right? On the comparative, governments don't have the money to do this because they're probably already bankrupt. But number two, governments don't have a voter bank incentive to expand out of tier 1 and tier 2 cities because these are not meaningful voting blocks. And private landlords probably also don't construct housing here because it's like they probably don't live here. They don't know much about the city. They don't know if it's a profitable thing or not. Corporates uniquely have data analytics team which tell them how profitable it is. What does this prove to you? Number one, this weighs on vulnerability because on top half, it is unclear whether who is the stakeholders is impacted most by it, right? Because if you're buying a house, if renting a house in the middle of the city, presumably you have some amount of income, right? The most vulnerable stakeholder is the one who's living outside the city who doesn't have enough income. We impact that. But secondly, we tell you to the extent to which overpopulation is a problem and like climate change is going to be a problem in cities in the next 10 years, ours is the only side that's exclusively able to solve it because we incentivize housing outside of areas. Very proud to be in closing opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech, and very happy to call the government whip, the first whip speaker in this round.
Awesome. Am I audible? Okay. When a member of opposition says companies build more things like greenery in the area and move into tier 2 cities, it almost sounds like they were whipping Jackie's extension. I thought I had to, but I guess not. I think they've already conceded here to the bulk of our extension that this is going to cause a gentrification, which is what the main contribution from CG in this round is going to be. I'll do a few things in the speech. First, talk about the extension that we give you. Second, weighing this against opening government. And finally, rebutting the opposition teams. I think the government burden in this round was to prove not only that this is bad, but that there's a necessity for government interference through banning. CG meets this highest burden by by proving the government must intervene through bans because 1, regulations cannot be meaningfully applied when they cannot be held accountable, but 2, there are no alternative mechanisms to regulate. Note that OO never says what good regulations look like, but the worst impact that we give you of gentrification is never something that you can regulate out on their side of the house, which means that regulations are structurally unable to deal with the problem that we give you out of closing government, which takes us over both opening teams. The highest order impact we give you then is this idea of gentrification that is totally untouched and even conceded by closing opposition. The reason these companies are likely to gentrify is because they eventually want the value of their property to increase. This is the largest magnitude impact in the round, insofar as not everyone will necessarily rent from BlackRock, which is the thrust of the OG cases that like monopolistic companies will set high prices and don't face competition. But even if not everyone rents from these organizations, and PM agrees with this when they say in setup that they don't own tons of housing in the area. However, when corporations conspire to gentrify the area, it hurts everyone in this area, winning us on magnitude in terms of the number of people who are affected in this round. But secondly, minority children go to different elementary schools and get their education off track. Everyone has to pay higher prices within the area, and racism increases due to a lack of social contact theory. So our impacts are much more intense and frequent than opening government, especially in light of opening opposition mitigation, which takes us over them. Thirdly, here, I think you hurt the least well-off individuals when you gentrify and kick them out, and this is also harmful on the long-term time weighing, insofar as it allows the richest to entrench their wealth and locks out the least well-off out of wealth over generations because they can't access these sorts of good housing and like good education and things like that. We think that then on the magnitude, the time frame, as well as the relevance of our extension, we're able to take it over opening government. In a POI, OO says that gentrification will only happen if you lobby, but firstly, they have first mover advantage and know the housing market in that area quite well. So it's really uncommon for companies to do this. But secondly, even if this is untrue, companies can collude to gentrify the area. Given that they all want to make longer term gains, even if collusion isn't direct, their incentives align to all throw money into this, which prevents factories from setting up, and they make new like shopping malls and things like that, which charge higher prices and cater to like white and majoritarian demographics. I think it's very clear then that we were able to beat opening government, given that 1, we give better engagement on accountability and address the specific political mechanisms that opening opposition gives by proving why people can't hold these companies accountable even if they wanted to, and why political momentum is hard to generate. But secondly, we take the best case of regulations existing, but show that it makes it difficult to ensure. And I think this is also a more powerful mechanism insofar as OG is uncharitable, and OO rightly points out that regulation might be well written in areas where governments are left-leaning, but this shows that companies will almost always avoid this sort of regulation, and the backlash becomes impossible. Then onto opposition bench. I think firstly on CO, they entirely concede our extension on gentrification when they themselves say that corporate landlords will add greenery. I think this means that the thrust of our case is already correct there. They accept the incentive to gentrify exists when they must deal with targeted evictions of minorities and such beautification efforts to increase living costs. I also think that OG is right to point out that like I don't think that just attacking the model is enough for them to win this debate, insofar as the simplicity of their extension is basically the government loses money, losing money is bad. And they never actually prove like how this loss of money occurs, why this loss of money is like going to be particularly dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. A few responses here. I think firstly, even if they like beat the OG model, like they never actually explicitly engage with closing government. I think it's way too late for the op-whip to bring this up. I think we already beat CG right there. But secondly, I think they have to prove why this sort of money that would otherwise be funded towards things like public housing in the first place. Gentrification makes it much more expensive and difficult for this to occur. But thirdly, I think even if the government loses some money, this is non-unique insofar as every form of government social spending is technically a loss of money. If we spend on Medicare or social welfare, that is also technically a loss of money. I think this is less so a loss of money than any other form of government spending, insofar as the government can resell this housing to other people, insofar as houses like have their own value. It doesn't mean that the government just like threw money at something and completely lost it. They are able to retain the value even on our side of the house, and they're able to resell this. But thirdly, I think it's unclear why they would spend on good things and not things like the military or something like that. They have to prove that this is specifically going to be spent towards something like public housing. But even if they do this, I think it's insufficient, because we tell you that there's going to that minorities are going to be structurally locked out on their side of the house. So this is a worse form of solution than what we give you. But finally, I think there's a government obligation to intervene to prevent the worst harms against the least well-off, even if you think that the government is losing money on our side of the house. And gentrification prevents these individuals from accessing long-term forms of wealth, accessing things like higher socioeconomic mobility on their side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Companies cannot monopolize specific regions because of competition, but even if they do, gentrification is unlikely because of investment distrust, because many minorities still pay the rent, and 3, you generally call them out because of political consumerism.
This was the same as your previous POI. I already responded to this. Even if collusion isn't going to be direct, I think these companies have an incentive to like align their money in order to like prevent things like factories from setting up, et cetera, et cetera. I think collusion is extremely likely on your side of the house. On to opening opposition. Several responses here. First, on sustainability, I think that it's unlikely for BlackRock to want to do this in the long term, as Jackie tells you. And I think that housing markets are volatile and they peak quickly. So they're likely to sell soon and not care about the long term. Given that interest rates are going up and things like that, I think that prices will decline eventually. And they never actually prove that company profitability matters or actually helps workers. So they don't access their only impact here, insofar as money will only be kept by people at the top of by the people at the top on their side of the house. But secondly, on their argument regarding regulation, I think they never prove capacity to regulate or what meaningful regulation looks like. Insofar as no regulation will ever ensure high quality, low pricing, no gentrification housing. There's just no policy mechanism there from their side of the house. I think firstly, it's easier to push back against regulation on our side of the house insofar as compared to a complete ban, insofar as on their side of the house, conservatives who are pro-business and neoliberal have incentives to roll them back in future administrations, which means that the regulation will never have the sort of long-term impact that our side will have by allowing people to gain socioeconomic mobility in the future. Their next argument is this idea that they get new housing on their side of the house. I think to get these benefits, they have to prove that supply increases at a rate fast enough to meet increasing demand that they agree increases really quickly. If this isn't true, it will be super expensive given that demand will always exceed supply. And given that there's a time lag in terms of building supply by getting things like housing permits, the construction time lag, environmental concerns, et cetera, I think demand will always exceed supply on their side of the house, making houses extremely high cost and meaning that they're unable to access their impacts and hurting people from being able to buy houses and access this sort of access like a rent as well. Finally, on the argument about like rich and middle class being worse, I think it's like harder to hold corporations accountable insofar as political consumerism doesn't work because of limited liability. It's harder to target these individuals because these corporations because public backlash against them does not work. But also given that laws against discrimination are unlikely to be enforced, I think that these individuals have better incentives insofar as they have more interaction with these individuals on a daily basis. For all these reasons, very project close.
Thank you very much to the government whip. I'm very happy to call the opposition whip to summarize the debate as a whole.
Hi, I just want to check that I'm audible. Okay, perfect. Just give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, but you can speak a little bit louder or came closer to the microphone because you're audible, but probably will be better quality of the audio.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do consent to streaming because I see someone else in chat. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This speech is going to be simple. I'm first going to explain why Shriram's extension beats the rest of the debate and then take out gov benches as a whole, first on closing government and then on opening government. I think Shriram's first extension tells you 2 things. A, presumably governments have limited housing budgets on both sides of the house. Insofar as you're taking away from subsidized housing to be able to pay off corporate landlords, that automatically means that you're taking away from individuals that could presumably access more like affordable housing. That automatically wins on the metric of vulnerability insofar as every team in this round wants to prioritize that, right? But B, Shriram's extension tells you that there is policy paralysis, which is to say that insofar as this is a policy motion, you need to defend the consequences of passing that policy, i.e. people losing faith in the housing market, people losing faith in the government and wondering what they're going to do next in the housing market. That is perverse on OG's own characterization because they tell you that this is a significant asset that people want to invest in. Obviously, you undercut this when you remove people's ability to invest in this because they're really confused about what the government is going to do next. This flips OG's own claim of private owners rushing in because it provides more robust analysis than opening opposition on why the private private owners that are likely to rush in are likely to be the most privileged owners, the ones that are only likely to take risks because they know that the government is going to back them no matter what. That means that on opening opposition's largest claim of privileged landlords, we win on that because we prove like a better analysis on that, right? But like note that the end of this is just that the policy, like the process of the policy is so bad, it literally does not matter whether I respond to opening government in every single one of their impacts because they're able to show you that the way that they do the policy in and of itself is bad. Note that closing government's only response to this is, but you don't prove that the government wants to do this in terms of housing. They could possibly want to do this in terms of putting money into the military. 2 things I want to note over here, right? Number 1, obviously government incentives are symmetric. If they're assuming that governments are so great that they want to go up against big corporations, we can symmetrically assume that governments are good and want to provide accessible housing, right? But B, we just think it's particularly popular. It is a huge vote bank incentive to prove to vulnerable people in rural areas that you're a government that's providing them premium housing. That's why there's an organic incentive to do that. But Sriram's second extension is more important, right? Because I think it short circuits the rest of the debate. It is important because it notes that our case operates in multiple scenarios. A, it reduces redlining because banks currently are like, corporations are the ones that have trusted you, have rented out this area to you. Particularly because of that, we are willing to give you a loan. We're willing to like invest in your small business, etc., because you already have an asset in terms of a house. That means that we win on scale because we also prove that there is a difference in just housing and there's a difference in the ways in which it operates in your personal life. But B, I think the ability to access housing is particularly only on closing opposition because people now get access to houses, particularly only because the government or like because corporations want to go in and invest in these tier 2 cities. Closing government's response to this is only gentrification. I don't know if gentrification is a net harm, which is why I just generally don't think it was important that Sriram responded to this. There are 2 reasons I would posit it is good. Number 1, Sriram particularly tells you that the government doesn't have an incentive to invest in tier 2 cities without this, which means that only when corporations already go in and set up the investment is when governments have the ability to do things like affordable housing, etc., which means that we win on net scale of like the benefits that we give to these vulnerable people. But B, obviously gentrification happens over a series of time. It cannot happen overnight. That means that the people that own housing, like currently their property value goes up, they're able to sell it for more in the future. That means that they get bigger benefits. We win on just the metric of vulnerability there too, right? On closing government, I want to respond to that 2 extensions. But the first thing I want to do is talk about this idea of gentrification. I think this relies on proving that richer people from rich neighborhoods want to suddenly move into poorer neighborhoods and settle down there. I think this is unlikely to be true without knifing their own opening that tells you that rich people in rich neighborhoods have a vast number of opportunities to decide to go into a house. They have a vast number of options available to them because corporations just exist in such large, have just existed in such large numeracies to begin with, which means that it is likely that you're probably, like if you're a rich individual, you're probably going to stay in a rich neighborhood. What does this mean? This means that Sriram's extension is proven true because the people that opt in to private housing or in vulnerable areas are most likely to be poor people. That means that corporations have an incentive to cater to them because this is their only like buyer, this is their only buy bank, which means that they're likely to want to be accessible and they're likely to want to care about these people. But the second thing that closing government says is, there's an impossibility of accountability. 2 things I want to note here. Number 1, I don't know why people need to understand financial webs to be able to just genuinely be like, my carpet has bed bugs, I want to sue you. But B, I don't think they specifically need to understand it themselves. They're more likely to be able to hire lawyers to do this, etc. Note that this mechanism is exclusive to opposition because when you hire a lawyer against a corporation, you go to a consumer court, as opposed to when you hire a lawyer against an individual, you go to a civil court where there's a 50-50 probability you will lose the case as compared to a consumer court where you're more likely to win because consumer courts just favor consumers. But third, I just want to make it clear, obviously you have class action suits. You can find a bunch of other people that have similar problems because you all exist in the same corporation. That means that you're more likely to win in terms of accountability. Closing government is pretty much out of this round, right? But I want to respond to opening government in 3 different ways. The first is that corporations acquire existing housing. The second is that this is a monopoly. And the third is private landlords, right? I want to address the last claim first, of private landlords being exclusionary. I think this mechanism in and of itself is self-defeating because to be able to get a mortgage to want to own a house, you need to be part of a valuable area or you need to have some collateral. Obviously, this is not true for individuals that are existing in vulnerable areas because of redlining, because banks generally don't think that they're a really good investment, etc. What does that mean? That means for this debate, Sriram's extension is particularly more important because he tells you that corporations do not care about these things. They already have abilities to analytically like decide whether this is a good investment, etc., which means that they're already safeguarding against risk when they go into these areas. That means 2 things, right? Number 1, Sriram extension solves redlining because you get money when you buy out houses if you believe opening government's characterization of corporation just buy out individuals, or you get money when you rent out these houses if you believe opening opposition's characterization. So just on interpretation of top half, Sriram's extension still beats both OG.
So when corporations buy large amounts of apartments and basically offer more than what market offers, this actually makes housing unaffordable. In a comparative, demand is driven only by private individuals who have less amount of money to spend on housing, meaning housing becomes more affordable for everyone. Please engage with this.
No, but that I think all of this is literally dealt with in Sriram's extension because he tells you that these private owners don't want to buy this like property to begin with, number 1. But number 2, more specifically, I'm just really unclear why corporations are able to buy this at like really expensive. Like presumably they will only buy it if it's incredibly cheap or they will make their own housing. So in either case, you create more housing on asset house. That automatically means more demand, which means that it just becomes more affordable, right? The second thing that I want to make clear about like private landlords is that it provides the mechanism for OO's claim of privilege because it particularly proves to you issue by specifically you have to have collateral. At that point, only privileged landlords are able to come in. This means that you don't have the ability to like credit opening opposition unless you credit closing opposition's extension of moving into vulnerable areas. The second thing I want to respond to is monopoly. I think this is glib, but like oil is a monopoly, transport like is for like fuel, like foods and ration in India is a monopoly. So insofar as that's true, I don't know how they principally prove why this monopoly is particularly bad. But B, I think the harm of monopoly is instrumental. Sriram particularly proves organic incentives to move to vulnerable areas. That means that we win on their own metric of accessibility. Insofar as that's true, closing off takes this debate. Super happy to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and thank you to all of the speakers for this great Octofinal. I would like to ask now the Oricon to take down the stream.